welcome to another episode of the Dead or Alive 5 Move Exhibition and Question Answering Series that hath no name. I am your hostess with the mostest, the pervy panty pirate pony princess, the badass bitch Blood 13 of the Richard E's website. Today we're going to be doing Ein, who is totally not Hayate if Hayate had amnesia and forgot who he was and used his surprisingly muscular physique that he doesn't know how he came to have to go learn karate. Also, look at this. Motherfucking shirtless as shit. Also has shackles on his fucking wrists. That's fetish shit, dude. And then he has this fucking mesh shirt. We're gonna pick this one, though, which is his fucking, like, Matrix-ass outfit. By the way, this is totally Hayate. He just Hayate with amnesia. Should happen in Dead or Alive, like, 3. Actually, no, it was Dead or Alive 2. Wow, I'm dumb. Anyways, though, totally doesn't matter. So the question this time, though, he only has 77 moves, really? Shit, this is gonna be easy. So the question this time, though, it's a long question. Because the person asked a specific question, but I'm actually going to do a different sort of thing with the question. So the full question is, have you ever wondered if people are traveling through time and constantly altering the timeline that you're living in? Like, if you looked at the overall picture as the universe is actually changing every second, but because you're a part of it changing, you don't have a memory of it changing. So basically saying, like, and this is me now, the question is basically asking, like, time travel, like, does time travel exist in the sense that, like, the universe is constantly being changed through time travel, but because you're part of the timeline that's changing, everything just sort of, like, you forget everything that happened, and that becomes the new reality whenever it happens. To which I say no. I don't think that. I think that in this instance, if we're going to think along the lines of, is time travel real, and if it is, how do you theorize that it works? My theory on how time travel would work is like it happens in, for instance, Red vs. Blue. People are going back in time and trying to alter the timeline, but you cannot alter the timeline because it's a definitive, solid-state thing. The only thing you can ever do is go back in history and cause something to happen. So if you go back in time and try to kill Hitler, then for some reason that would be why Hitler ends up the way he does. That's my personal theory on it anyways. Which you would think that if time travel becomes a major thing in the future, then Hitler should have tried to have been assassinated about 108 times, and every one of them have failed for whatever reason. But, just various things like that. So, that's my take on time travel. If time travel real, that's how it would be, is you wouldn't be able to alter the past, you would just be able to somehow be a catalyst or one of many catalysts for why events turned out the way they did. So, now that said, though, we can go into time travel theories, because there are 100,000 different versions of time travel that have been used in science fiction. But actually, no, let me expand on that a little more, what I was talking about before. Because there was the whole thing that Stephen Hawking supposedly did, I think it was Stephen Hawking anyways, the whole party for time travelers deal, which was he held a party, and it was like a party that was at a set time and a set date, but he didn't tell anyone that the party was happening until the day after the party happened. And then he sent out invitations and made it this huge, huge thing in the scientific world. And it was a party for time travelers. Because the idea was, if he didn't tell anybody that the party was happening, then time travelers from the future would know that the next day he said when the party happened, and they could go back to that time. So let's talk about this, though. Number one. And, okay, the whole, time traveling party thing, it has been used as a experimental proof as to how time travel does not exist. Because if it existed, then people would have traveled back in time to the party. So let's talk about this now. Fucking no! That's stupid! It literally, it's like, I don't know, it's an extremely, extremely shallow way of thinking. Number one, how do you know that if time travel exists in the future, if it exists, how do you know that there's not rules applied to it? Like, you can't go back in time and be part of an event. Like, if you travel back in time, because you're not supposed to be there, you are basically a spectral thing. What if ghosts are time travelers traveling backwards or forwards in time, and you're seeing a vision of them that you're not supposed to see. And what if, for instance, like, let's say a ghost, for instance, though, is, like, everyone always sees, like, it was my grandfather, or it was this person, or whatever. What if that's just a trick of the mind, or what if that's just a cloak to a time traveler? So a time traveler can go back and visit a time, or whatever, and they'll be there, and their spectral, like, version of themselves appears, and... There we go. Wow, my brain stopped completely. It's like the spectral version of themselves appears, but their cloaking is to appear as somebody else. And it would be a different thing for each person, or it would be set to, like, the area they're in or something. And it would be so that no one would suspect that time travel were an actual thing. I think that could be a possibility. But, like I was saying, what if there's rules of time travel where you can't go back and be part of an event, you can only witness the event? So, you couldn't go back to be part of Stephen Hawking's fucking party because it's against the rules of time travel. Either against the rules that were set up by man itself, or the rules that were set up by the time travel thing itself. Like, maybe through the method of time travel they've invented, you can't interact with things. It's just beyond the limitations of the technology. Now, there's that. Then there's also the fact of, what if people in the future who have time travel don't want us to know in the past that they have time travel? Here's my reasoning for this one, because this makes sense. Number one, what if the future's a horrible place, and shit like that happens, or whatever? That's a whole other thing. Because then you don't want people being able to come back to the fucking past, because they'll come back here, and it'll be like the whole thing from South Park with the Tucker Jews or whatever, so... That's a whole thing. But moreover, I think what the reasoning for it would be is very, very, very logical. And it's the time loop that no one seems to think about until somebody poses it to them, and then it's like, oh my god, I've never thought of that before. And it's basically the causality loop, is I guess what it's called. I don't know for sure. But let's say, for example, that we're here in this time, okay? And let's say Stephen Hawking had his party. And let's say time travelers from the future came to that party. So then we know time travel exists in the future. But that means also then that we have to create time travel at some point. Because if time travel exists in the future, then clearly we are the ones that have to make it. Now here's the problem. If we know time travel exists, and if we know that we have to make it, who's going to make it? Because unless people focus on making it, unless it becomes a drive to make it, if it's just a thing if everyone sits around and says, oh, we're going to have time travel because we know from the experiment that time travel exists in the future, and no one makes time travel, then through some sort of loop of events not happening, if no one makes time travel, how did the people in the future travel back to the party? They couldn't have. So then, in that instance, the party would never have had time travelers appear in it, and then somebody would have invented time travel to travel back in time to the party to say, look, we have time travel. But then nobody would invent time travel because everyone would think it was somebody else's responsibility, and so no one would go back to the party, and it would be a constant, endless loop. And that's the problem with time travel is, like I said, as far as I know, it's called the causality loop, which is that if you go back in time and alter something, then there's no need to go back in time and alter it in the first place, because it never happened. And if it never happened, you never had a reason to go back. So how could you have gone back in time in the first place? Because if it never happened, you didn't go back in time to fix it. So it's a constant, it's an endless loop of, you can't cause something to not happen, because if you cause it to not happen, then you couldn't have gone back to stop something that didn't happen. This is the kind of thing that people fucking go crazy over, apparently. But it's, like I said, it's a whole thing of time travel is fucking confusing as shit and why it really can't work in terms of physical science. Unless, and this is the thing here, there is a way that time travel can work, and it's usually covered in science fiction as being the case. Because altering the past, like I said, has that problem of if you go back to fix it, then it doesn't happen, so you have no reason to go back in time, so it happens anyways, more or less, usually. So the way this is avoided is, every time you go back in time, what happens is not you're altering the past, you're altering the past of a different, identical, or almost identical timeline to your own. It's basically a thing of, every time you go back in time, you're creating a branch or a split in time. So when you go back in time, your timeline branches, and it basically becomes, for instance, if you flip a coin, and it lands on heads, you go back in time, flip it again, it lands on tails. You've created a branch in two different universes, where in one universe that coin flip was heads, and in another universe that coin was tails. Or not universe, but timeline. But basically the two timelines would be separate from each other, at the same time they were nearly identical. But then there would be obviously the consequences from each action, and those would spread on beyond the entire, like, everything, from basically a butterfly effect. Now, the whole thing about that is pretty much, it's best summed up, I think, in Dragon Ball Z. Because in Dragon Ball Z, Trunks goes back in time to warn every one of the androids, but when he does, when he travels back in time to tell them, he creates a split in the timeline. So, in his future, where he came from, where the androids killed everyone is still dead. But in the timeline the series follows, everyone survives, because Trunks went back in time to warn them. So, again, like I said, even after everything has been resolved, even after the androids have been beaten, actually they weren't really, because Cell shows up and absorbs them, whatever, doesn't matter. After all of that, though, like, everybody survives and everything, but when Trunks goes back to his future, everyone will still be dead to him in that future, because it's a different timeline. It is an identical timeline with identical people, but the events went completely differently. It's just like the fact that, in Cell's timeline, I have to turn around now. In the timeline that Cell comes from, he kills Trunks. Obviously that's not the case, because Trunks exists in his timeline, and comes back to the timeline to tell everybody else, and then eventually goes back to his timeline and kills Imperfect Cell. But in the timeline Cell came from, he kills Trunks and steals his time machine. So it's just it's a constant thing of, whenever something gets altered in a timeline, it creates a branch. You can visit other timelines, but if you do, you're only going to be affecting that timeline. You can never affect your own. And it's pretty much it would be anyways, a preset thing. I think I had my back to her for a second and didn't realize it. Now I'm not happy about myself. But it would be a thing of, whatever you do in that timeline is something that you were predestined to do in the first place, more or less. So, yeah, that was easy enough. So, to turn my back to somebody, I just use up and towards them and punch. Got it. Easy. I only have like a few moves. I only have one move that I can do with my back to somebody. Like, really? Alright, whatever. So anyways, that one and this. Boom. So that was an extremely long description, but that's pretty much like my everything on time travel, is it has to be a thing of, whenever you alter the past, you're just altering the past of a different timeline, because you can't change your future or your present or anything else. Whatever you know is definitive and solid, and it cannot be changed. So yeah, there you go. That was a very long description. I could go so much further into time travel, but there's no point. I feel like there was something else I was going to say, though. The only thing I can think of is, it's something called the grandfather paradox, which is, if you go back in time and kill your grandfather, you can't be born. But if you're not born, how do you go back in time to kill yourself? Time travel makes no fucking sense in that way. That's why, again, the only thing that can happen is a branching timeline, because then you go back in time and kill your grandfather. You didn't kill your grandfather, you killed a copy of your grandfather in a different universe, and so in that universe, you can never be born. Ta-da. That's pretty much all I have to say on the matter. I really need to stop before I go on, because otherwise I will, because time travel is one of those, like, thought experiments that's just really fucking awesome to me. But regardless, we're gonna end it here. This episode probably made your brain melt if you've been watching all these episodes. All the other ones did not compare at all to the amount of thought that went into this one. And if you'll notice, I was able to more or less keep up with what the fuck was happening on the screen with Ain's moves, because I thought of this so much. But regardless, that's the end of this one. So tune in next time for another character, another moveset, and another question.